with fossil fuels begin to be cost competitive. That's the only way it will work.
Well, let's go back for a minute and talk about what we are actually facing. I mean, it's amazing to come back from Copenhagen after 2 weeks there where the entire discussion was about global warming, back to the U.S. media where there is almost no mention. It's more the politics of what did it mean for President Obama to swoop in? Did he save the talks? Did he collapse the talks? Whatever. But actually what the stakes are. You begin your book, Storms of My Grandchildren, by talking about a tipping point. What do you mean by that, Dr. Hansen?
Well, there are tipping points in the climate system where we can push the system beyond a point where the dynamics begins to take over. For example, in the case of an ice sheet, once it begins to disintegrate and slide into the ocean, you've passed the point where you can stop it. So that's what we have to avoid. Another tipping point is in the survival of species. As we begin to put pressure on species and move the climate zone so that some of the species can't survive because they can only live within certain climate parameters, because species depend upon each other, you can drive an ecosystem such that when some species go extinct, then the entire ecosystem will collapse. So you don't want to push the system that far. And these tipping points are not hypothetical. We know from the Earth's history that these have happened in the past, especially when we've had large global warmings. We've driven more than half the species on the planet to extinction. And then over hundreds of thousands and millions of years, new species come into being. But for any time scale that we can imagine, we would be leaving a much more desolate planet for our children and grandchildren and future generations. So we don't want to pass those tipping points.
And how do you know that we are headed in that direction? What in your work has told you this?
Well, in the case, say, of the ice sheets and sea level, we began in 2002 to get this spectacular data from the gravity satellite, which measures the gravitational field of the Earth with such a high precision that you can get the mass of the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheets. And what we see is that in 2002 to 2005, we were losing mass from Greenland at a rate of about 150 cubic kilometers per year. Well, now that's doubled to about 300 cubic kilometers per year. And likewise, the mass loss from Antarctica has also doubled over that time period. So we can see that we're moving toward a tipping point where those ice sheets will begin to disintegrate more rapidly and sea level will go up. And that's one of the bases and others for saying that a safe level of carbon dioxide is actually less than what we have now.
Which is?
What we have now is 387 parts per million, but we're going to have to bring that down to 350 parts per million or less. And that's still possible provided we phase out coal emissions over the next few decades. That's possible. We would also have to prohibit unconventional fossil fuels like tar sands and oil shale. But if you look at what governments are doing, the reason that you know that the kind of accords they're talking about are not going to work is because look at what they're actually doing. The United States had just agreed to have a pipeline from the tar sands in Canada to the United States. Yes, so they're planning on actually burning those tar sands, which we can't do.
Explain how that works. What are the tar sands? I mean, this was a major issue in Copenhagen, and we played a number of pieces, especially Indigenous people, for example, marching on the Canadian embassy to try to stop the drilling.
They're among the dirtiest fossil fuels on the planet. There's oil mixed in the ground with the sand. You have to cook that material to get oil to drip out of it. That takes a lot of energy to cook it. And then you end up with oil, which also has carbon. And then you burn the oil, and you get more carbon. So it's much more carbon intensive than oil itself.
We get more oil from Canada than anywhere else in the world. Is that right?
I'm not sure about that, but the plan is, in the long run, there's much more there in tar sands than even in Saudi Arabia. So the point is, we're going to have to move to the energy system beyond fossil fuels. We need to drive the economic system so that we move to a clean energy future. And there are many other advantages in doing that, cleaning up the atmosphere cleaning up the ocean. You get the mercury and arsenic and all these pollutants are coming from fossil fuels. So we need to get off this fossil fuel addiction. And the way you would do that is to put a gradually rising price on the carbon emissions.
How many times have you been arrested protesting now the issue of coal and mountaintop removal?
A couple of times in West Virginia with regard to the mountaintop removal, and in Boston where we were sleeping out on the Boston Commons.
So how did you go from being the head of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies to getting arrested for these protests?
Well, these protests are what we call civil resistance, in the same way that Gandhi did. We're trying to draw attention to the injustice, because this is really analogous. This is a moral issue, analogous to that faced by Lincoln with slavery or by Churchill with Nazism. Because what we have here is a tremendous case of intergenerational injustice, because we are causing the problem, but our children and grandchildren are going to suffer the consequences. And our parents didn't know that they were causing a problem for future generations, but we do. The science has become very clear, and we're going to have to move to a clean energy future, and we could do that, and there would be many other advantages of doing it. Why don't we do it? Because of the special interests and because of the role of money in Washington.
Now, you don't just protest outside of, these companies that do mountaintop removal. You were protesting outside the Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC.
Yeah, they and some other environmental organizations have become too much of the Washington scene, and they're trying to work on the terms that Washington now works on, in which the lobbyists are driving the legislation. We have to get the legislation designed in the public's interest, not in the interests of the people who have the money to influence the process.
We're going to break and then come back. Our guest today is James Hansen, Storms of My Children, the truth about the coming climate catastrophe, and our last chance to save humanity is his first book. He's the director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, teaches at Columbia University. He's been arrested protesting coal mining and didn't go to Copenhagen because he wanted those talks to collapse, felt they wouldn't save the planet. This is Democracy Now! Back in a minute.
It's the morning, I can see the sunrise burn away the moon. Shades of evening, they vanish as the light pours through my room. But today I'm on my way, send a word to mother that I'm coming home. 'Cause today I'm on my way, walk beneath the sun on a winter's day. Just a native son, those days they told me I'll never change things. You know that I'll never break my own way. When I was young, and I would walk beneath the stars, always chase the angels to the desert. I'll go all the angels to the desert.
Peter Kirk, native son, here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest is Jim Hansen. Storms of My Grandchildren is his new book, The Truth About the Coming Climate Catastrophe and Our Last Chance to Save Humanity. I wanted to play for you, Dr. Hansen, the comment of the Prime Minister of Nepal. Days before the climate talks began in Copenhagen, cabinet ministers from Nepal held a cabinet meeting on Mount Everest at the base to send a message on the impact of global warming on the Himalayas. I spoke to the Nepalese Prime Minister in Copenhagen.
The global warming has its impact on the top of the mountain, and the snows are melting. Glaciers, many of the glaciers, Himalayan glaciers has evaporated, has disappeared. Many glacier lakes are emerging, and many of the glacier lakes are the verge of outburst. So we have seen many landslides there, and no regular ramp.